Let's take a look at two of the earliest known civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt. We often have the impression that the use of the land adjoining the Nile was a simple matter of accepting nature's bounty, but this is not so. The land on the riverbank would have been a tangle of swamps and reeds that needed to be reclaimed before it could have been used, and this reclamation was no easy undertaking. In fact, this reclamation was, according to Child, a stupendous task. The swamps had to be drained by channels, the violence of floodwaters to be restrained by banks, the thickets to be cleared away, the wild beasts lurking in them to be eliminated. No small groups could hope to make headway against such obstacles. It needed a strong force capable of acting together to cope with recurrent crises. Much the same comments could be made about Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. There the land had not just to be cleared, but it had to be created more or less ex nihilo. Originally consisting of swamps lying just above the level of the Persian Gulf, the Tigris-Euphrates delta needed to be reclaimed, a dry land created out of a watery chaos. The words of Genesis appear to be particularly applicable to this process. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." Some of the earliest cities in the region were constructed on platforms of reeds laid out on the alluvial mud. Just as in the case of the Nile communities, so too in Sumeria, reclamation required large-scale social cooperation. The drainage, irrigation, and protection of this land gave rise to a centrally controlled economic system. Raw materials were needed, and so regular systems of trade had to be created to obtain them, requiring merchants, transport workers, specialist craftsmen, and those willing and able to provide security, people to keep records, and, most interesting for our purposes, state officials to reconcile conflicting interests. What the Mesopotamians had to construct laboriously via their cities was given as a gift of nature to the Egyptians. The cities on the plains of Mesopotamia had no natural means of defence, whereas Egypt itself as a whole had natural ramparts of mountain, sea, and desert. This gave a decidedly different tone to Egyptian cities. The walled town made its appearance in Egypt, says Mumford, before the dynastic centralization of power. But there may well have been a long period, a pax Egyptiana, that relaxed both the internal tension and the need for external protection. When the walled city came back again, it was more of an agent of common defence against foreign invaders than a means of making local coercion possible. Unlike the cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the cities of the New World did not come into existence alongside river valleys, nor did they arise from the social conditions necessary to produce and maintain systems of irrigation. Here the cities seem to have been formed primarily in response to social and cultural pressures, principally religious and political. While the Egyptian state seems to have been produced directly from a condition of villagization without going through intermediate city conditions, in Sumeria some 15 to 20 different city-states emerged more or less simultaneously, all politically independent, although sharing a common religion and language as well as being economically interdependent. From time to time, one of these cities would achieve ascendancy over the others. The economic unit in Sumer, writes Child, is a city with outlying fields and hamlets, which could and did function by itself. In Egypt, on the contrary, the unit is the kingdom as a royal estate. The manors or cities into which it may be subdivided would cease to function if isolated from it, or rather would relapse into more or less self-sufficing peasant communities. Child points out that such river valley communities provided the nascent conditions for coercion. Outside the horizons of the river lies desert or wilderness, so those who work the land are geographically circumscribed. Moreover, while even the strongest of rulers cannot prevent the raindrops falling on your head, they can restrict your access to irrigation. So, says Child, when the social will comes to be expressed through a chief or a king, he is invested not merely with moral authority, but with coercive force too. he can apply sanctions against the disobedient. We might adopt as a working definition of the state that of Bruce Trigger, who describes it as a politically organised society that is regarded by those who live in it as sovereign or politically independent and has leaders who control its social, political, legal, economic and cultural activities. Those who controlled access to the water controlled the land and its products. Individual farmers faced a very high cost for failing to cooperate in maintaining the political structure. Without irrigation, which could be provided only on a large scale, crops would not grow. No crops meant starvation. Though sharing some similarities, Egypt and Mesopotamia differed from one another in other respects, Egypt being what Trigger calls a territorial state, and Mesopotamia being a city-state, or rather a collection of city-states. A city-state is a relatively small polity consisting of an urban centre located within a hinterland of farmland with possibly outlying minor settlements. We may note in passing that most Greek city-states, so-called, were not cities and were only dubiously states. Many had no urban core to speak of. In city-states, the leading citizens tended to know one another personally. Perhaps as a result, there was a markedly diminished tendency to divinize its rulers. It's hard to believe that the man you've known as an uncouth child is really a god. A territorial state, on the other hand, generally occupied a relatively larger area and was governed by a ruler who ruled through a hierarchy of sub-rulers or administrators located in a corresponding hierarchy of urban centres. This is certainly one way to see things, but not the only way. Some archaeologists, anthropologists, see city-states and territorial states not as co-equal forms of political structures, but as various stages in a progression. One such progression would be pre-state module, city-state, territorial state, empire. Others, while agreeing that city-states and territorial states are not coordinate polities, would reverse some of the stages in the previous example. Instead of the city-state moving upwards and onwards towards territorial states, some, such as Joyce Marcus, see city-states emerging rather from the disintegration of territorial states. There is no way to be absolutely sure about these matters. According to Trigger, city-states tended to exist in a kind of geographical network. Their territory was relatively compact, perhaps less than 10 kilometers across, with a modest population of between 5 and 20,000 people. Some, of course, had larger territories and larger populations. The urban centres of these city-states attracted specialist artisans and encouraged specialization. In its early dynastic phase, southern Mesopotamia, Sumeria, consisted of a network of quasi-independent city-states. Territorial states, and Trigger is thinking primarily of Shang China, Egypt and the Inca here, had to develop an effective bureaucracy in order to persist. Egypt may have begun in the form of embryonic Mesopotamian-like city-states. However, even if this were so, those city-states were quickly subsumed under a central government. The territory governed by territorial states was significantly larger than that controlled by city-states. Territorial states were also less populous than city-states. They were governed by an upper-class ruling family and other leading families. And the rulers of territorial states had access to a much greater surplus than did the rulers of city-states. In territorial states, a relatively large degree of economic control was required in accumulating the surpluses, running the administration, supplying the army, paying for public works projects, and so on. Political control was in large part indirect in territorial states. Whereas in city-states rulers and ruled were relatively close socially, in territorial states there was a significant gap between the rulers and the agricultural workers. Across the various early civilizations, despite their manifold individual differences, certain matters appear to be relatively constant. All had a single supreme ruler. All were based on social and economic inequalities, both in society at large and within the family. Trigger notes that ideas of inequality and obedience to authority were inculcated in everyone from earliest childhood. The concept of obedience was reinforced in schools, social life, and relations with government officials. In all these societies, a small number of very wealthy and powerful people were supported by a very large number of producers and taxpayers. The position of the upper classes was protected by military force and by law. Does this sound familiar? In many cases, the internal relationships of the state were modelled on that of the family and vice versa. This was explicitly the case in China, but also appeared in one form or another in other early states. There was a pervasive tendency to model family relations on those that characterized the state. Families were conceptualized as miniature kingdoms in which the father had the same relation to his wife or wives, children, and other dependents that a monarch had to his subjects. The agricultural and urban revolutions brought many social and political consequences in their train. Apart from the agricultural surpluses that made craft specialization possible, it also saw the emergence of a special class for whom the manipulation and control of violence was the key to social domination. Where aggression brings successful results, there is an incentive to increase the size of the aggressing group, God or the devil usually being on the side of the big battalions. Since not everyone has the time, the disposition, or the capacity to exercise violence successfully, the incentive arises for some to specialize in this area. These specialists, which Davidson and Rees-Mogg characterize as the forefathers of government, increasingly devoted themselves to plunder and protection from plunder. Along with priests, they became the first wealthy persons in history. Just as agriculture involves the shift from hunting animals to domesticating them, so too the political means, the method of the incipient state, originates in the move from simply robbing and killing other people, more or less indiscriminately, to, as it were, domesticating them and taking a portion of their produce at regular intervals. We might call this the domestication of predation, which, as a long-term strategy, is much more productive than outright confiscation and destruction. Just as farmers have domesticated animals over which they exercise control, so too the specialists in violence have their own domesticated animals, the farmers, over whom they exercise control. Violence is not necessarily random or pathological, but can be used as an instrument of spoliation. The powerful were now able to organize a new form of predation, a local monopoly of violence or government. For a latter-day, albeit fictional, example of this, think of the film The Magnificent Seven, in which the villagers who live in the valley grow the crops which the bandits who live in the hills take from them by force, leaving them enough to live on so that they may continue to produce and be robbed again and again. The bandits, if they can establish themselves permanently in their position, fighting off rival bandits and preventing uprising by the villagers, will form a kind of aristocracy. As Child notes, writing in 1936, the domestication of predation is quite common. It survives, he says, in a very simple form in East Africa. It was characteristic of medieval Europe and was widespread in antiquity. Oppenheimer argues that the state is ultimately dependent and parasitic upon the economic means generated by society, so that no state can come into being until the economic means has created a definite number of objects for the satisfaction of needs, which objects may be taken away or appropriated by warlike robbery. Since farmers, unlike hunter-gatherers, are effectively tied to the land, the chance that others will seek to exploit them is high. In the face of aggression, escape by migration is not an attractive option, even when it is possible. As escape becomes more difficult, opportunities for organized shakedowns and plunder increased. Farmers were subject to raids at harvest time, which gradually raised the scale of warfare. Domestic animals living on the land, and the crops grown on it are valuable possessions that could be stolen and hence had to be guarded from predators. And the land itself now also became an asset, worthy of being stolen and therefore worthy of protection. In his comprehensive tome, The Origins of Political Order, Francis Fukuyama refers to an article by Mancur Olson that makes more or less the same point that I have been making about the transition from sporadic banditry, the politico-economic equivalent of hunting and gathering, to domestic predation, the politico-economic equivalent of agriculture. Fukuyama rejects Olson's thesis on the basis that the rulers of traditional agrarian societies, which Olson calls stationary bandits, did not tax their subjects to the maximum. But it's not necessary to commit to the thesis that stationary bandits or domestic bandits will always employ their power maximally. There is clearly a range within which such bandits can continue to predate without, as it were, killing the goose that lays the golden egg. Above this range, their subjects cannot survive. Below this range, the predators cannot survive. It would be a minor miracle if these 2 points were always to coincide. One finds an astonishing degree of agreement among scholars that the state and violence are intimately related. If you were to ask David Hume how the state originated, he would say that almost all the governments which exist at present, or of which there remains any record in story, have been founded originally in usurpation or conquest, or both, without any pretense of a fair consent or voluntary subjection of the people. Anthony de Jay writes that, as a matter of fact, the real-life states that people actually endure have come into existence because their ancestors were beaten into obedience by an invader, and sometimes, due to Hobson's choice, had to take one king so as to escape the threat of getting another. And Crispin Sartwell remarks that almost any realistic view of the origin of states will attribute their founding, or at any rate their development and preservation, to the large-scale application of violence. The renowned attorney Clarence Estaro rejects as a fairy tale for idiot children the idea that states came into existence to discourage and punish the evil and the lawless, and to protect the weak and helpless. On the contrary, he claims, history shows that the state was born in aggression, and that in all the various stages through which it has passed, its essential characteristics have been preserved. The actions of the state rests on violence and force, is sustained by soldiers, policemen and courts, and is contrary to the ideal peace and order that make for the happiness and progress of the human race. Albert J. Nock writes that the state originated in conquest and confiscation as a device for maintaining the stratification of society permanently into 2 classes, an owning and exploiting class, relatively small, and a propertyless dependent class. No state known to history originated in any other manner or for any other purpose than to enable the continuous economic exploitation of one class by another. James Scott, the historian, notes that much, if not most, of the population of the early states was unfree. They were subjects under duress. To live in such a state rendered you liable for taxes, conscription, corvée labour, and implied, for most, a condition of servitude. In substance, then, these early states were war-making machines, producing hemorrhages of subjects fleeing conscription, invasion, and plunder. The warrior class coeval with these emergent states demanded a portion of the produce, a portion that steadily rose in tandem with a rise in overall population, so that, where productive capacity was at a premium, the warrior group could take a large fraction of total output. These warriors founded the first states with the proceeds of this rake-off, which reached as high as 25% of the grain crop and 1/2 the increase in herds of domesticated animals. Farming, therefore, dramatically increased the importance of coercion. The surge in resources capable of being plundered led to a large surge in plunder. Another popular, indeed very popular, form of aggression was the capture of human beings for use as slaves. Child again. War helped to a great discovery. that men, as well as animals, can be domesticated. Instead of killing a defeated enemy, he might be enslaved. In return for his life, he could be made to work. By early historic times, slavery was the foundation of ancient industry and a potent instrument in the accumulation of capital. Any group of people may conceivably need protection from aggression by other groups. In many cases, this is provided by the group itself, acting in an ad hoc fashion. Where a community possesses a quasi-specialized group of hunters, it is likely that such will provide the core of any defensive unit. There are, however, in human history, many examples of would-be protectors going into the aggression business themselves and turning from watchdog to wolf. Mumford writes, "But the very prosperity and peaceableness of the Neolithic village may have caused its protectors to exchange the watchdog's role for the wolf's, demanding protection money, so to say, in an increasingly one-sided transaction." Mumford posits a development from hunter to political chief and eventually to king. What originally were voluntary offerings would then become coercively extracted taxes and tributes. The increase in power and production capacity, made possible by the arrival of the city, also made possible for the first time the mass extermination and mass appropriation that is war, as distinct from the border skirmish or occasional cattle raid. War has its origins, then, not in some peculiar human pathology that is magnified in groups, but is rather a function of a particular and distinctive mode of human social organization. Once a city came into being, it had to secure its material base. If its population grew, then its supply lines had to be extended and the areas of food production increased. Was this to be done by predation or by some kind of process of symbiosis? A power myth, says Mumford, knows only one answer. Thus the very success of urban civilization gave sanction to bellicose habits and demands that continually undermined it and nullified its benefits. What began as a self-contained urban droplet would be forcibly blown into an iridescent soap bubble of empire, imposing in its dimension, but fragile in proportion to its size. In this lecture, we took a look at the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations and the beginnings of organized violence. The next lecture will concern itself with the emergence of the ruling class.